The following program is a presentation of WMHT Schenectady.
On October 1st, 1976, Conrail ordered a halt to all operations on its Catskill Mountain Branch Railroad. In railroad terms, the Catskill Mountain Branch was a light-density line, just like 144 other short railroads scattered throughout the eastern U.S. Under its federally sponsored reorganization plan, Conrail has, or would like to, get rid of all of these railroads. The Catskill Mountain Branch was not always a light-density line. Once it was a busy, prosperous railroad called the Ulster and Delaware. Its tracks stretched from the Hudson River city of Kingston across the Catskill Mountains more than 100 miles to Oneonta, New York. But when the last train was dispatched along the badly neglected tracks, it carried only a few carloads of feed grain and had orders to return with all the empty cars left along the line. The railroad hadn't carried a passenger since 1954. These are scenes from a movie made on the line in 1906. The title is The Hold-Up of the Rocky Mountain Express. The Phoenicia Station was a stand-in for a frontier town of the West. In the movie, the good guys win and the train gets through. But the U&D Railroad itself wasn't so lucky. By 1932, the line was bankrupt and the New York Central took it over. And when the New York Central was absorbed into the Penn Central system, the old U&D went with it. Now Penn Central is bankrupt too, and Conrail operates the trains. Even so, the Penn Central Company still owns the tracks and the right-of-way. And because Penn Central is bankrupt, it has to sell the line. The man in charge of doing that is E.M. Dixon.
Mr. Dixon, what's the railroad's attitude or policy towards the abandonment of lines such as the Catskill Branch Railroad?
I presume you're referring to the disposition of such lines.
Yes, sir.
And the policy is that if there's a genuine interest and by a group or another party or entity in acquiring the line for continued rail operation, we're willing to negotiate for such a sale. If there is no interest in the line for continued rail operation, then the track is offered for bid and the right-of-way is marketed by our real estate department, either as a right-of-way or as separate parcels.
The real estate that Penn Central owns passes through the most scenic areas of the Catskills. At the western end of the line is Delaware County, where there is no official interest in saving the railroad. But on the eastern half of the line lies Ulster County, where tourism is a major industry. And it is in Ulster County that the future of the Ulster and Delaware Railroad will probably be decided. Several years ago, Woodstock theater owner Harris Gordon founded an organization called the Catskill Mountain Transportation Corporation.
That time of the year.
Can you tell me in a brief way what the Catskill Mountain Transportation Corporation is?
The Catskill Mountain Transportation Corporation is set up as a railroad, under the New York state law. It's a business corporation. Every railroad has to be set up as such. However, it is at the present time a public service organization in effect that isn't actually functioning as a railroad. Its principal purpose at the present time is to try to coordinate the efforts of individuals and public officials, counties, state, the federal government, in an effort to preserve what remains of the railroad and to bring it back into operation as a railroad.
How successful have you been at that?
Well, the fact that Ulster County is now excited about the possibility of developing a steam locomotive tourist attraction indicates that we've been successful in arousing public interest.
The government of Ulster County is excited about the railroad, an excitement due in large part to Herb Heckler, County Planning Board Director.
All right, well, when did you as a county official first become interested in trying to save the Ulster and Delaware Railroad?
When the last trains were rolling. That was in late September of last year. And then I wrote a memorandum shortly after that to the county legislature suggesting that we bring together all the people who would have an interest in it, from the Catskill Mountain Transportation Corporation, the State Department of Transportation, the town supervisors, etc. And we then had that meeting in February. And at that meeting, we presented various alternative reuses. That
And what was the response of county government?
Fantastic. They were very interested in the possibilities for it.
Well, why is there such a sudden interest now, whereas the line has been around for a long time?
The key was the matter of passenger steam tourism. And up till now, it was mainly discussed as a freight railroad.
Without Delaware County on the line, there would definitely not be enough freight business to support the railroad. So Ulster County must now decide if it wants to head in the direction of a steam tourist line. There are several steam tourist lines now operating around the country. One of the most successful is in Strasburg, Pennsylvania. It carries over 300,000 people a year. Strasburg was started and continues to be run by a local group of railroad enthusiasts. But it's aided by the presence of a newly completed State Railroad Museum right across the street. And it has an ideal location. It's right in the middle of the Pennsylvania Dutch country, a major national tourist attraction. Most steam railroads are neither so successful nor so well located. But Herb Heckler thinks the location of the U&D tracks is a definite advantage.
Strasburg is indeed a profitable one, but in the East Coast, most of the railroads seem to be just breaking even, and some of them are running in the red.
That's
what
all
makes you think that this one could support itself?
A, the proximity to the New York, Connecticut, New Jersey market area. Secondly, the actual physical plant that is here, where you have the combination of the Ashokan Reservoir, the Catskill Mountains, the Esopus Creek. This is just beautiful country, which many of the other railroads don't have to offer. Not many. They don't,
the
period.
Scenery is
the scenery,
make this different from...
absolutely. The scenery and the proximity.
The problem now is deciding exactly how practical it is to revive the railroad. To find out, the county has appropriated $10,000 for a feasibility study. Ernest Gardner has a canoe business not far from the railroad tracks. He's also chairman of the Ulster County Legislature, which voted the money for the study.
The legislature just voted $10,000 for a feasibility study on this railroad. Do you think the legislature was railroaded into that decision?
No, I don't think the legislature was railroaded into the decision at all. I think that the legislature as a whole is enthusiastic about the idea, the possibility of having a scenic railway coming through the northern section of the county, the northwestern section of the county. It will bring some tourist dollars into the county, but the $10,000 actually was voted upon for a feasibility study to determine if indeed it is a good idea to go ahead with the railroad or whether to drop it entirely.
One of the things the feasibility study will have to examine is just how much it will cost to put the tracks back in shape so that trains can run on them again. The Catskill Mountain Transportation Corporation contends that it has been Penn Central policy to systematically neglect maintenance on the line.
Has there been a policy with lines that you regard as economically in trouble over the long range to neglect maintenance and to kind of say, well, we're going to write it off eventually anyway?
I don't think there's any policy of that sort. I think you have to recognize that where a line is not economically viable, it's difficult to justify expenditures of a major magnitude on the maintenance of such lines.
Even more important, of course, is the price Penn Central will ask for the railroad. According to Dixon, the company hasn't yet figured out what it wants for the line, but he did give some indication of how Penn Central would arrive at its price.
In general, does the railroad expect to get more for if a particular line is if the right of way is to be used for railroad purposes rather than say for a linear park or for private land purposes?
Yes, a line for railroad purposes commands a higher price than property for other purposes.
Do you have any personal preference for, would you like to see railroads like this be restored? Does that mean anything special to railroad people, or is it just as a local endeavor?
Well, I think it has to be something that can be economically justified. There's no reason, as I see it, to have a line restored which can't be a viable operation.
But here on the one hand, you say that the line is for consideration for abandonment because it isn't valuable to Penn Central, and then you turn around and say it has considerable potential value as a railroad. Isn't that in contradiction?
Not really. If someone sees it as a potentially valuable railroad and wishes to buy it for that purpose, of course, that's up to them.
It's the old line that if somebody is willing to buy something for twice as much as it's worth to sell it for 4 times, that's a good sale.
Well, I don't know if you can draw that comparison, but obviously, as you say, in the last analysis, it becomes a matter of negotiation.
If Ulster County does decide to negotiate to buy the railroad, it will have to rely in part on information already gathered by people like Earl Pardini, the current president of the Catskill Mountain Transportation Corporation.
What do you think is going to happen in the near future?
Well, either one of two things can happen. Either we figure out a way to save this branch and put it back in operation, or it's going to be ripped up. And
what happens if it's ripped up?
If it's ripped up, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about the possibility of making a linear park out of it. But there's a lot of opposition to that. The thought of having extensive use as a hiking trail would be really nice. It would be nice to have a hiking trail, but we all who live in this area know that it would be a very short amount of time before it would be overrun with snowmobilers and mini bikes and other kinds of recreational use which aren't particularly well accepted by all members of the population.
If Pardini's group and the county fail to come up with the money necessary to buy the railroad, there is a real possibility that motorbikes and snowmobiles will someday ride along the right-of-way where the U&D tracks now lie. But that is an issue that will most likely be resolved not in Ulster County, but at the state capitol in Albany. New York State is the largest single landowner in Ulster County, with 130,000 acres in the Catskill State Park. The railroad runs right through the middle of it. The state agency in charge of administering the Catskill Park is the Department of Environmental Conservation. And Commissioner Peter Burley has been closely following railroad developments in the county. He's willing to lend moral support to the concept of a steam tourist railroad.
If it's economically feasible?
Absolutely. It was built as a railroad, and if it can be maintained as a railroad, that ought to happen. It ought to happen because, obviously, rail transport is not only a useful and environmentally sound thing to do, it's a tremendous experience, and we're getting to a point where it may be the last one left. Aside from that, though, it seems to me that the right-of-way and the land that represents and the potential that represents is very exciting and really fantastic as a recreational resource, whether it be as a railroad in the future or as a right-of-way for fishing access, for cross-country skiing, for snowmobiling. It's a resource that must be preserved, I think, in the public domain so that it can be used as this great gateway through the Catskills.
Burley says his department is seriously considering buying the line, but not as a railroad.
We don't have the legal authority to buy it and turn it over to someone else who would operate it as a railroad. I've taken the position that if there is any feasibility to keep this as a railroad, that must be explored first, and I'm glad that the county and others who have this concern are pursuing that. I've also taken the position that if that's not feasible, that then we must be ready to move through this combination and pooling of efforts between ourselves and hopefully some recreational money from parks and the federal government to be able to acquire that right-of-way so that it does remain in the public domain.
Earl Pardini and the Catskill Mountain Transportation Corporation aren't interested in just any recreation on railroad land. They want the trains to run again. And it's their enthusiasm that has brought the prospect of a reborn railroad this close to being a reality.
Those of us from the Catskill Mountain Transportation Corporation do know from our own research, or do feel from our own research, that there is an economic basis for saving this branch. The impact of having a steam tourist operation on this railroad with or without a freight service is a viable organization in itself. And it's just bring it to the proper light, to the proper people to show that to be true.
If it gets started, what would you like to do?
I'd like to operate it. I'd like to be directly involved in pulling the thing back together and finding new ways of having people learn about how to fix a railroad perhaps on this. Perhaps we could have a track school. I'd like to see sawmills put back into operation in conjunction with this to use our own timber, our own Catskill Mountain timber, to rebuild these ties here and stuff that are all falling apart. And what's nice about it, I think, is that the Catskill region of itself would have all the raw materials, both in the forms of manpower and of wood for our ties and so forth, to completely put this thing, or almost completely, in operating condition.
The Catskill Mountain Transportation Corporation has not been alone in its struggle to save the railroad. It has received considerable support from the local press. The newspaper that has been most active on behalf of efforts to save the line is the Woodstock Times. Editor and publisher Getty Sveikauskas explains his interest in the railroad.
I'm not a railroad buff at all. I see this as simply as a project that would work, and I'd be interested in any other kind of project of the same, of a different kind that would work. It's a romantic interest in the sense that there's a balance of economic and environmental aesthetics provided by it. It's romantic in the sense that tying together communities, villages, instead of this kind of insane strip development that automobiles bring, is something that has a romantic interest to me personally.
Have you ever seen anything else like this in the county?
No, absolutely not.
Local people contacted for this program agreed that the railroad must be able to support itself. At the same time, each person, in his own way, shared the sense of romance that Getty Sveikauskas talked about.
I remember it well, particularly the Mount Pleasant station. And I remember when I was a little boy going over to the Mount Pleasant station to meet the mail train when it came in with the mail carrier at that time, and I used to ride with him, and it was a big thrill to meet the train.
So there's something more than just a business investment if it were to actually happen for you. You'd like to see it happen?
Yes, very much. I think it would be an excellent thing. There is some romantic value to it as far as I am concerned.
Here we have the railroad, which is actually a life belt, or was a life belt for many years, and can be that again.
I would really like to work on it. I think it's one of the few pioneering fields left in the United States, if you might say so.
Well, the big dream is from the old days. This railroad was developed with the dayliners, and the dayliners brought people up here. They transferred to the train, and that brought them up into the mountains.
I don't know. For me, there's a sense of the past and the future that are brought together by this project that has tremendous appeal, and I think that it's a kind of a gut level appeal that a lot of people seem to have.
It's a long way from the manicured tracks and the shiny engines of the Strasburg, Pennsylvania line to the overgrown rails of the Catskill Mountain Branch. And the Phoenicia station of 70 years ago bears little resemblance to that same station today. People of this part of Ulster County have let their feelings be known that they don't want this train to have made the last ride on the U&D.
This has been a presentation of WMHT Schenectady.
It's been 2 years since trains ran on this track. They did little enough maintenance when the trains were actually rolling. And now things have gotten really out of hand, at least here along Railroad Rapids near Phoenicia, where the train used to go along. My name's Perry Teasdale, and I made the tape that you just saw, and I thought maybe it would be helpful if I did a little postscript on what's happened in the 2 years since the tape was shot, and in the year since it was broadcast last fall. The county did do their study, this feasibility study, and what the recommendation was that they go ahead and try to set up a railroad because they could make money on it. And In the interim, what's happened is they've been trying to get some movement out of Penn Central. Penn Central, though the railroad part of it's bankrupt, is not in such terrible shape. Their amusement park and oil refinery interests are doing rather well. So they were in no hurry to sell this rather valuable real estate along the Esopus Creek and beyond in Delaware County. And they now have agreed to a selling price. The county figures it's going to cost about $3 million, not only to buy the land that the railroad sits on right now, but also to put the tracks back in shape so that trains can run on them again. And then they've got the problem of figuring out what trains are going to be running on them, since the Ulster County nor Delaware County owns any rolling stock. And the idea most often put forward is that they'll have something called Steamtown. Steamtown is apparently the world's largest collection of steam-operated machines, especially railroad engines and cars, in the world. They're located in a place called Bellows Falls, Vermont, and they want to move. The two places that have given them definite offers, according to them anyway, is Ulster County here and also Orlando, Florida, right next to Disney World. The attraction of Orlando, Florida, of course, is a longer operating season than they have in Vermont or that they'd have here if they came, and the proximity to Disney World, which means a huge, huge crowd of people coming in, maybe 3 to 5 million a year. Ulster County has a potential, at least if it's only Steamtown, of maybe 500,000 people a year, perhaps more. Some people call that figure conservative. That's if Steamtown locates near Kingston, or actually right off the Thruway exchange at Kingston. And Steamtown seems to be willing to do that, although there's been a lot of haggling back and forth. And the county really has to come up with a property and a plan first. And it turns out also that there seems to be more necessary than just having the trains. It seems that Steamtown would like, and also the county would like, to have some sort of theme park, I guess they're called, some sort of recreational family-type facility where people can go to be amused while they're waiting for trains, I guess, maybe learn a little bit about the trains. I don't want to set myself up as an expert on the railroad because I'm not. I live right down the road, and that's how I got interested in this line. Anyway, it turns out that last week, the Marriott Corporation, which is a huge company, is interested in doing their own feasibility study on setting up a theme park here, and they've hired consultants to do it. It may or may not be significant that they're spending twice as much on their feasibility study as the county spent on the one they did for the railroad itself. They'll have some sort of a determination sometime in the late fall. That's about the time, apparently, that the Steamtown people want to make their decision about what's going to go on here on the railroad tracks if they decide to locate here. And so things are still kind of in limbo. I really don't have too much more information than that, other than the fact that there's been a lot of talk about a lot of people coming here, and there are a lot of people who are interested in revitalizing this railroad still. It's still front page news often on the Kingston paper anyway. And there are a few people who are concerned about what an extra 500,000 to 1.5 million people might mean to Ulster County. And that's something that is probably going to emerge as a major issue as things develop further with the railroad. Now we started out with a little railroad that was disappearing, and now we have to deal with a potential doubling, perhaps even tripling in the population of the county in the peak months of the year. I'm going to wrap this up now because it's going to rain in a few minutes. But if you have any other questions, the people to contact in Ulster County would be Herb Heckler, who's the county planning director, and Earl Pardini on the Catskill Mountain Transportation Corporation, both of whom you saw on the tape that just played. And if you have any questions about how this tape was made, or if you're interested in finding out more about video, you can talk to the person right outside this monitor, who will give you a hand and let you have that information. Thank you.
tonight's action.
This Cobleskill train station has been closed for years, but drew an appreciable crowd today. They had come early armed with all kinds of cameras to catch a shot of a one-of-a-kind railroad engine. You couldn't eat your lunch?
No, you're right. Get too nervous. It gives once-in-a-lifetime chance to see something like this.
Nicknamed Big Boy, the former Union Pacific steam engine was being towed from Steamtown in Bellows Falls, Vermont, to its new home in Scranton, Pennsylvania.
Well, this engine's 130 feet long. It's almost 3 times the length of the diesels nowadays. They should preserve more of these for historical purposes, just like Challenger used to be here on the D&H. They're gone forever.
The shutters clicked in unison as it rumbled through the Cobleskill yard, its 100 tons testing the rails. Built by the American Locomotive Company in Schenectady, the 1940 vintage Pufferbelly could hit speeds of 60 to 70 miles an hour. And as soon as the engine passed, the train buffs were off again, hoping to catch another glance of Big Boy as it moved south toward Scranton, Pennsylvania. Doug Myers, TV 10 Action News.